Kerryn Phelps, welcome back to Breakfast.
Hello, Fran.
What do you think of the Prime Minister's panel? Will you support it?
I think it's very important that the government has today recognised that there is a need for medical practitioners to be in charge of medical decisions and not bureaucrats. Now, this is about emergency medical transfers of critically ill people from Manus Island and Nauru. And until now, there has been a long, lengthy delay. There has been almost obsessive legal intervention to try and stop people who are ill from being transferred over to Australia for the care that they need. This is today a recognition that the system is broken, it is not working. And so it's not going to solve the problem, because we still have bureaucrats making the medical decisions and then being reviewed by a medical panel. What we need to see is a fast tracking of these medical transfers, and that's why the bill that's before the Parliament is the preferred bill.
So, hang on, just to say, what's wrong with the Prime Minister's, as you say, recognises that doctors need to be making the final decisions, not bureaucrats. That's exactly what the Prime Minister set up, isn't it? So, by your argument, you should support it.
There is a layer of bureaucracy before you get to that medical panel. So what's happening at the moment is we've got bureaucrats making the decisions and running these sick people through their refugee advocates through the courts, trying to make the case. And in every single case, and there have been hundreds of them, it's been decided that the medical decision was correct in the first place. What the bill that has gone through the Senate already and will be before the House next week seeks to do is to take those initial decisions out of the hands of bureaucrats and put them in the hands of doctors. Now, So
how would that work if somebody presents sick in Manus Island?
Manus Island or Nauru.
What happens then under your bill?
Under the bill that has been through the Senate and we'll be considering next week, what will happen is that a doctor on Manus Island or Nauru will say, we cannot cope with this case on Manus or Nauru. We need help. And then a second doctor would agree, and that might be a doctor who is on Manus or Nauru, or it could be
a doctor in Canberra.
by telemedicine, which is how we conduct remote medicine here in Australia now, and for people living in remote areas in Australia, where a specialist might come in by remote medicine and say, yes, I've done a case review and I agree. Now, under the bill that's before Parliament at the moment, the minister then has the right within 24 hours to say, I have national security concerns, this person cannot come. If they say that that they disagree medically with the opinion of those two doctors, then it immediately goes to a medical panel for review. It's a fast-track, streamlined procedure which cuts through the obfuscation and the obstruction that we've seen until now. And it's just unconscionable the way these people have been treated. And we've had 13 medical colleges and 6,000 doctors sign a petition calling for a change to the system.
And the Prime Minister seems to have responded to that in degree, though, because his what's called the Medical Transfer Clinical Assurance Panel will be doctors. It'll be the Chief Medical Officer. It'll include doctors, representatives of the AMA and others, and it would provide clinical assurance over decisions made by the department. The significant thing as far as the government is concerned, I believe, is that ultimately the immigration minister would still have final veto powers, and that's the government's concern about the bill that's come from the Senate, the bill you support, which is that under your system, as you've just acknowledged, the minister does not necessarily have final veto power over this. The government says that's a threat to national security.
Well, the minister does have a veto power on the grounds of national security.
Yes, but not on a medical ground.
But not on medical grounds. And it's not appropriate for a bureaucrat or a politician to be able to veto the treatment of a person who is critically ill where the doctors looking after that patient say they cannot treat the patient on site in Manus Island or Nauru. And that's the whole strength of the bill that's coming to the Parliament next week, is because it takes that decision-making out of the hands of bureaucrats, out of the hands of lawyers and the courts, and it makes it a medical decision where it should be. And bearing in mind that this is a temporary transfer for the purpose of medical treatment. It's not a permanent settlement in Australia. So it doesn't affect border security. It doesn't affect the concerns that some people have raised about, this is going to affect border protection. It's not going to do any of those things.
Well, with respect, I think some people listening go, well, what would Kerryn Phelps know? She's a doctor. She doesn't know about national security. This is the, ambit of the Prime Minister and his minister. And in fact, the Prime Minister is sending a letter to Bill Shorten, according to the Oz today, warning that these provisions you've just described would hand oversight of border security to two doctors, which will, quote, take the final decision of who comes to Australia out of the hands of the elected government of this country. And he says that will be a threat to national security.
There is a national security protection in the bill that's before Parliament. I don't believe that the announcement that has been made through the Australian newspaper today, and nobody's actually seen what this bill involves, apparently, except for the Australian newspaper, and I certainly haven't seen it. But I haven't seen anything in those reports that would encourage me, or I believe other crossbenchers, to change their view or their vote. Have
you spoken to Cathy McGowan? Because the suggestion is that Cathy McGowan is one crossbencher who may be persuaded by the government's panel.
I will be speaking to Cathy McGowan. She has said before that if the government came up with something better, that she may reconsider. But in my view, this is not something better. So I haven't seen anything that looks better than the legislation that is before the Parliament next week.
So you wouldn't vote for this plan? I
would not vote for this plan, certainly not without seeing the finer detail. But I haven't seen anything that would make me change my view. You know, you have to understand that the legislation that's before the Parliament that's passed the Senate was the result of a very fine collaborative effort between like-minded politicians, refugee advocates and lawyers who have seen the problem firsthand, who understand what the problem is. I mean, I had doctors from Médecins Sans Frontières come to visit me in Parliament and explain to me in some detail their experience, their observations of what the situation was like on Manus Island and Nauru. And this is what's happening on Australia's watch. The only reason that children have been removed from detention is because of community pressure. The government was keeping children there for 5 years or more without any hope of a future of freedom or safety until the community put pressure on them. And now we're seeing that the medical profession is needing to step up along with refugee advocates to say the medical situation on Manus Island, Nauru is unacceptable and needs to change.
Do you understand, though, there is another imperative, a political imperative for the government, that if the bill that you support goes into the Parliament, into the Reps and passes next week, it will be the first time since 1929 that a government has lost a vote in the House on legislation in the House of Reps, which would be a major defeat for Scott Morrison and some say could amount to a vote of no confidence in the government. Do you think that's what's at stake?
Well, maybe there's something wrong with the political processes, that a good idea can't get through Parliament without, you know, the sky falling in. I mean, the fact is that this is a good piece of legislation which will create a solution to a problem that doctors and refugee advocates are telling us needs to be solved.
Okay, so what's your message to the government? If this does get voted in, if they get voted down, if they get defeated next week, would you be saying that's a vote of no confidence in the government and the government should go?
I don't think this is not a supply bill, it's not a confidence bill. I think this is a bill that is common sense, that has been thought through very carefully, that is a solution to a problem and doesn't have to bring down a government.
So you wouldn't be supporting calls for an early election on the back of this, for instance?
I don't think it is necessary to call for an early election. There is an election which must happen before May. So within months, the Australian people will have the opportunity to say, this is our next government. Whoever is voted in as the next government will be the people's voice. And so what we need to see is a sensible, careful medical solution to a medical problem, and that's what this legislation seeks to do.
Our guest is Dr. Kerryn Phelps, the independent member for Wentworth. With regard to children, Scott Morrison only became Prime Minister in August. Since then, 109 kids will be brought off Nauru, all children off Nauru by the end of this week. Do you give the Prime Minister credit for that?
The Prime Minister had to be dragged kicking and screaming to remove the children from Nauru. The government had absolutely no intention. There are children who have been on Nauru for more than 5 years before they were removed. Some of them have reached adulthood and gone through their teens on Nauru without being removed. And it's only because the community started speaking up. The hashtag Kids Off Nauru activity started. And then there was the Wentworth by-election campaign. And that campaign, that by-election, brought to the public's attention, because it became an election issue, the plight of children on Nauru. And Australians just stood up in numbers and said, not good enough and not in our name. And that's why things changed.
Just finally, you campaigned for Kids on Nauru. That was part of your pitch for Wentworth. You won Wentworth. What about the 1,000 adults still left on Nauru and Manus? Will you take up their cause?
I think there needs to be a solution, and it needs to be about a settlement arrangement for those people, and there needs to be, I believe, a regional solution to this. That's beyond the scope of this current legislation. This current legislation is about people who are so unwell well, that they cannot be treated on Manus Island and Nauru. And I think we must maintain a focus on that objective, which is in Parliament next week. And I look forward to making sure that there is going to be a solution for those sick people.
Kerryn Phelps, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Fran.